Geospatial data. My name is Drew Clark. I'm editor and publisher of Broadband Breakfast, and I am joined by Randy Lenning of Broadband Toolkit. He will be our chief presenter during the course of this webinar, and thank you for taking the time to sign up and learn more about this resource that is available in Broadband Toolkit. Let me just say a few words about the state of the broadband mapping discussion that we're in at this moment. As you know, the National Broadband Map was created by the FCC, I guess for the second time. There already had been one many years ago, but in response to repeated concerns about the problems and the problematic nature of broadband data, and particularly with the passage of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act in November 2021, there was a concrete need for specific data about locations of address-specific locations. And then became a whole long process to create a broadband serviceable location map. What we are now in, or the process we're now in, that map contributed to the NTIA at the Commerce Department, the National Telecommunications and Information Administration's decisions about which states or how much each particular state could receive in funding. Those awards were announced just over 2 months ago, and we're now deep in the process of broadband implementation. States are developing their proposals. They're called initial proposals with specific details of their deployment targets per the maps that they've got. But that's really not the end of the story. In some ways, it's not even the start of the story, because the state broadband leaders and those that work with them need to have very actionable intelligence, data-driven information. And as the industry assembles to discuss BEAD implementation, including at our BEAD implementation summit next Thursday, the 21st, if you're in Washington, D.C., or if you'd like to join in via webinar, those are both available. As we move into this phase, many people are going to need a better comprehension of the data that exists, how it can be visualized, how investors can identify opportunities, and again, how state broadband leaders ensure that limited public funds are directed at cost-effective projects. I've had a chance to play around a little bit with the broadbandtoolkit.com, and I am glad you're with us to hear more about this tool, this resource, and how it can be used. I will say one more quick thing about Randy, about Broadband Toolkit. Randy was one of the participants on our program on Broadband Breakfast Live Online just 6 days ago on what's new in broadband mapping. That discussion and all the others on Broadband Breakfast Live Online are available at broadbandbreakfast.com. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Randy. We'll be here for at least an hour. Randy is available to stay around a little bit longer if you'd like, but let's go to that point. As you've got questions in the webinar, feel free to pose them. I'll be behind the scenes collecting them, assembling them, and after about 30 minutes, 35 minutes of presentation, we will take your questions and engage on them. So with that, Randy, let me go ahead and turn it over to you.
Good, thank you, thank you, Drew. And yeah, just to let everyone know that we've basically been put together a presentation that starts at some basics, because there are often definitional questions that people have, and then flows through to increasingly sophisticated topics. And once we do get to the Q&A section, basically we have a lot of live tools that actually show the entire US. So, you may be in Washington, D.C., or in Montana, or in Oklahoma, or in the Northern Mariana Islands, and it doesn't matter. We've got your territory covered and can actually take questions and talk about that. But I think between now and then, we'll go through a whole bunch of important conceptual components. So with that, what I'm going to do is share my screen here. Okay, so I think we should have the presentation streaming for everyone. So basically what we'll do is broken into several sections, and part of the goal is to sort of speak to the interests of investors, broadband providers, state regulators, and others, and manufacturers. So it's a very broad audience, but we'll hit all of the highlights. and there's a Q&A section on your user interface where you can drop in questions, and we'll generally come back to those at the end. And unless if there's something catastrophic I'm missing, Drew will inject and we can address that. But otherwise, we'll try to just get through some of the content first. So first of all, many of you woke up on November 18th, 2022, and there was suddenly a big announcement. The FCC had announced its map, and this was the culmination of a couple years of work. And what's interesting is there were two different versions. There was a version, if you were a consumer, you could click on the map and zoom in and find your house, and that was very, very exciting. And you could see, who was serving you or not. And then there was another piece that was basically data files. And what's interesting is, the media got very excited about the map, but the data files didn't get a lot of love and attention, at least not initially, and understandably, because it took some effort to unpack them. But a lot of what we're going to do, today is focus on, the what you can extract from the data files, because it's quite substantial and particularly for people who are planners, who are envisioning new networks. It provides really the critical and most usable content. So the National Broadband Map, which many of you have visited hundreds or thousands of times, is at this URL, and you can click on one button to see the map and a different button to see the data. One of the very interesting innovations, with the FCC fabric is, first of all, it moved to a set of points. So, in any geographic area, every location was included in the data set. And then also it was mapped both to census blocks and hexagons. And census blocks have been used historically, by the FCC and of course the Census Bureau, but by the FCC in representing broadband, via the Form 477 process. And they're useful because they map to political boundaries, but they also have the characteristic that they're very small in urban areas and large in rural areas. But the areas that are often most significant or most contested in terms of quality of broadband are typically rural areas. So the FCC included a hexagonal framework, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But basically, in rural areas, it gives you an order of magnitude greater resolution, and so it's very, very powerful. So our toolkits use both, or some toolkits use each, but we sort of skew towards the hexagons just because they're immensely, beneficial and high precision. And so h3geo.org is the organization that will give you all the details on that. Another question that is we often get people asking about this is which is fairly basic but very important, is the distinction between locations and units. So you can think of a location as a building structure, and a unit as either a residence or a building, or a residence or a business. And so in this example in New York City, there are 783 locations within a particular hexagon and 21,212 units. And units are also numerically very close to homes passed. So for those of you who do fiber planning and think about homes passed, it's a very good proxy. And so here are a few views that just help you think about how you can visualize data. Oftentimes when we look at population density or housing unit density or household density, we often see it through the lens of a census map, which generally covers all geographies, and there are empty census blocks, but they're relatively rare. When you move to a hexagon framework, what's interesting is you get a lot of visibility into physically blank areas, so areas that have sort of no human presence, at least in terms of structures. And so in this example, every dot that has any kind of color has some human presence, so has businesses or residences or something. Areas that are blank are in fact blank. There are no residences there, and a lot of the U.S. is blank. And here, of course, we're also showing density, so it's turning red as you go into cities. Here's another view, and this is just from the available sort of fabric metadata. This shows MTU densities. So this is the ratio of units to locations. And if you're in a rural area, most structures are a single family home or a single business. As you get into really dense urban areas, then that changes, and a lot of things are MTUs. And this lets you see that. So this slide, basically steps through the process that we've experienced since the launch of the Broadband Data Act, which was signed into law in March of 2020. And conceptually, it was a process that started with property records and satellite imagery and other data in sources, and then resulted in a building database and resulted in the release of fabrics, the fabric version 1, 2, and 3, and also had a lot of challenge processes along the way. You had missing location challenges, you had bulk availability challenges, and now we have state challenge processes. Concurrent with that, there were a lot of federal funding programs that had happened in the past, like RDOF, CAF2, Reconnect, and many others. And many of these had resulted in awards, but many of those locations had not yet been built. And so those sort of flow through the logic as well. And a lot of the focus of federal agencies and even state organizations has been on data collection and making sure this process is robust. There's been less public discussion of what do we do with the data once we've got it, and so that's what we're going to try to talk through today. And you'll see a lot of examples where all of this stuff, everything that's been publicly made available has been boiled up into some very useful tools, and we'll talk about what you can do with that. The data collection process of the FCC collects certain types of information on providers, on the technology deployed, on performance, and on whether you're serving businesses, residences, or both. They also categorize technologies, and we'll talk about this in a little bit more detail. One of the very significant aspects, which is largely related to BEAD, and we have a section on BEAD that's coming up, is sort of service thresholds. So basically between at 25 megabits down and 3 megabits up, you've got the dividing line between unserved and underserved, sort of using BEAD vocabulary. And then at 100 megabits down and 20 megabits up, you've got the dividing line between served or sort of qualifying broadband and underserved. And these are very important, and a lot of the visualization of data that we do in our toolkits, but that most people do, references these thresholds. And just to give you an example of visualization, and again, if we were doing census blocks, it would look a little bit different. But this is an example here where we're showing just the presence of fully qualified broadband and basically in this case, it looks like a bunch of dots, but actually each dot is a hexagon, and the hexagon turns green if there is one location there that is showing performance at the specified threshold. But within that hexagon, there may be others that aren't experiencing that performance level. So we have a terminology that we use, which we call presence, and we'll distinguish that from a different metric statistically. So here, if we change the threshold to 25.3, we see that larger areas suddenly appear. But one of the things that people may ask as a question is if something doesn't appear in green, is it unpopulated or simply uncovered? And from this particular graph, you can't actually tell, okay? So you need to zoom in further. And here, this is a close-up view. We see individual hexagons, and within the hexagon, it shows the number of broadband serviceable locations. And so it also shows hexagons that are populated but are not served. And in this case, we're defining served using the four BEAD quote unquote reliable technologies, which we'll talk about shortly. So the blank areas you could view as populated but not served. So so that's a quick introduction to a number of definitions. Let me now drill into some ways of visualizing things. Here is a view, and this is an area in Utah, and mountainous areas are great because you have big rugged expanses with no people, and then you have populated pockets. So here you have just rugged mountains, which there's basically nothing there other than rock and soil, but no residences. You have some areas, for instance, here where you've got a little hexagon and it's showing a number. These are populated, but not served. And then the colored areas are served at the specified threshold. And in this case, they're color coded by technology. So here we have fiber on top, and underneath cable, and then DSL, and then licensed terrestrial wireless. And this is kind of a useful view because people often want to know what technology is present, and they want to see that for a particular speed. But you can also deselect some of these areas. So if you turned off fiber, you'd see a ton of cable. And if you turned off, cable and DSL, you'd see a ton of licensed fixed wireless. So it's very helpful to just understand what's there. Here's a more complex example, and this example comes from our fiber strategy toolkit. And those of you who do market research probably understand the concept of a crosstab, where you ask several questions and then you quantify the results, sort of the composite of those, the interactions of those questions. So this is a view that you could think of as a crosstab. So this is the areas that have color, have fiber, but not just fiber. They provide residential service. And not only do they have fiber and residential service, they also provide gigabit symmetrical quality of service. So several parameters have been specified here. So if you look at this, you might say, wow, this is great. This area in Kansas has absolutely spectacular service, and they've got very good service, okay? But if we look at the next slide, this is what we call a depth calculation. And this shows what percentage of locations actually have the specified quality of service. So the parameters we're specifying are the same, but you can see on the left, it's very, very high, generally 100%. And as you look at other areas, sometimes it's in the single digits. So it varies widely. So this is a very important parameter and is included in a lot of our more advanced, in all of the tools to some extent, but in some of the more advanced tools, extensively. Finally, within the fiber strategy toolkit, we have an ability to actually drill down to individual location level data. So so here we've got hexagons, representing all fiber providers in white, and then major fiber providers in colored layers on top of that. And here we have sort of an AT&T layer in blue, and we tried to use brand colors. In this case, we've got two competing fiber providers, which is a little bit unusual, but you can see it breaks it out in terms of the location ID and the speeds and kind of all of the parameters. So this is is very, very powerful. And this what this allows you to do is this takes all of the relevant information that is released by the FCC in their data downloads, but you can grab it for a very specific area and actually export it into a spreadsheet and do further analysis. So that's some general definitional information. And now what I'm going to do is take us through a planning process, okay? And for everyone who does planning, your objectives may be different, but I'm just going to make it relatively simple here. Let's imagine that we're an ISP and we're looking for a profitable area to do build out. And so there are two very important considerations. One is, do you have fiber competition? And generally, people don't go head to head and overbuild other fiber providers, although sometimes they do, but generally they don't. And then secondly, we're looking for high density. So if you have one person per 20 square miles, if you're a for-profit fiber provider, you're probably not going to build there. And so we have some tools to do that kind of filtering. And what's interesting though, there are tons of areas that are high density and need fiber, and so there's a lot of opportunity. So we'll go through several tools that kind of show how to do that, and we're actually going to look at the problem through three different lenses. One, we're going to look at some pre-configured fiber build areas. So this is a study that we did about 6 months ago, where we basically took the entire nation and said, let's just assume we're going to build out fiber everywhere that doesn't have fiber and that is reasonably economic according to different thresholds. What would that look like? So we've done that exercise. We'll show you some of those results. We also have a tool called the Fiber Strategy Toolkit that has some dynamic features that lets you do essentially the same thing. And with the click of a mouse, go through and reset your parameters. And then finally, we have a new toolkit, which hasn't shipped yet, but it's in sort of customer trials right now and is being refined, but is coming out soon. It's called the Fiber Pre-Engineering Toolkit. And what it does is it analyzes every road in the United States and breaks them into little road segments and calculates lengths and calculates a bunch of metrics, and basically lets them be used in calculations as you think about where you should deploy. So it's very, very powerful. So first, with the pre-configured build areas. A broadband provider will often look at the world and in deciding where to build, there are at least two very significant dimensions. One is, what's the density? And here we're showing 4 different types of densities, and these are shown as number of locations per hexagon. And the hexagon on average worldwide is about 0.7 square kilometers, a level 8 hexagon. So this gives you some sense. And at about 100 locations per hexagon, about half of the hexagons at that threshold already have fiber. So that's so people are pretty engaged, although there's tons of opportunity that's unexploited at this point as well. The other dimension that's important is the number of locations. If you are trying to hire a team to come in and do construction, and you have 100 homes, the team may say, "Thank you very much, I'm not interested," or the price point may be exorbitantly high, and so. So there's usually a minimum amount that a provider would want to deal with. At the same time, there may be an upper limit as well, where they they may be limited by capital resources or other physical constraints. So basically, the data is going to break along these two dimensions. And so here, let's see. So here is an example, and we've just grabbed a random part of the U.S. and turned it on, and this is now showing these examples at 100 locations per hexagon. And what it's done is there's been a clustering algorithm that's been run in the background that identifies buildable areas. And it's actually sorted them from the largest to the smallest at each sort of set of thresholds. And so, and for each one here, you can see it has the number of locations and units. It's got the area measured in numbers of hexagons and other parameters. So again, this is all sort of prepackaged. So just to show you, a little bit about the logic here. In this case, we've turned on, a layer that shows existing fiber builds. And so here you can see the red, which shows existing residential fiber, and you can see that it doesn't overlap. So that's one of the parameters that's constraining sort of, the automated design areas. We can also look at areas that are populated or not. So in some states, you have large unpopulated areas. In Illinois, not so much, at least in this area. So you do have some areas where there are no hexagons. So these are unpopulated, but they're relatively far and few between. Generally, if there's no existing fiber and it's not being built, it has something to do with the density. So here you can actually see the number of locations per hexagon, and you can see a lot of lower density areas, at least low relative to the threshold we've set. And here you can see each of the clusters still has a unique color because the tool is kind of showing us distinguishing one from the other. If we turn that off, we can actually see all of the hexagons that meet the threshold. And you have little ones like, here's one hexagon surrounded by things of lower density. So it's not being included in the result because it's an island. But if you're a provider that has built out this area or this area, then you would extend your coverage and build it out. Okay, so anyway, this all just gives you a little bit about the what's in about sort of the logic behind this approach. So now let's go to another approach with a different tool, and this is actually conceptually very similar, but it's just showing you it's not pre-configured, so everything that you can do on the fly. So here we're showing again the number of locations per hexagon, and we're showing buildable areas in green and existing residential fiber in red. And then let's turn off the existing residential fiber, and so we'll see the buildable areas. And now one of the interesting attributes is you can change the threshold. So here it's at 100 locations per hexagon. So we can increase it to 150, and you see that the areas shrink. And then you can also, turn it into, you can also lower the threshold, and you'll see that they grow. So here at 50, you've got larger areas, but of course the density is a little bit lower. And so we're bringing it back to the original threshold of 100, and I'm turning on a feature that shows BEAD eligible areas. And this is a complicated subject, and we'll address it in an upcoming section, but basically everything that is an potential unserved project area is appearing as sort of an olive colored hexagon. And then on top, in addition, the number of unserved locations are also shown as numbers. So if you look at this, you might scratch your head and say, wow, this is pretty disappointing. There's not much there. But what's interesting is if you zoom out to a larger area, there's actually a ton of BEAD eligible areas. It's just not in that particular neighborhood. So this is why it's very helpful to have a tool that visualizes all of this. And then just a couple things that are noteworthy, and these are other capabilities of the toolkit. So here we turn on the depth capability. So we're showing, what percentage of locations have residential broadband, and what you're seeing in purple and green is the area that was previously red. So this is currently deployed broadband. What's very interesting is that there are areas where just a small percentage of locations are being passed, by existing providers. So even though, if you look for a binary result that's either on or off, or is it covered or not, you would say it's all covered. Yet if you sort of drill down and look at depth, you see that's not the case. And then finally, this shows, if we're drilling down to an individual level, we can see who is actually deployed there. And here we have, in this case, in this particular hexagon, and there are several different players in this area, but we have one provider that is providing a gigabit symmetrical in one location and 5 gig symmetrical at another location within the same hexagon. So it's very dynamic. So finally, before we finish this section, I want to go to just a small target area. And there's nothing actually special about this, except that we're going to use it as an exercise, and it's our make-believe build area. So if you see there are 10 hexagons that are being displayed. And here we've also changed the label from locations to units. And if you remember, a unit is very similar to home passed, and it's the difference is that it's a it includes business, non-enterprise businesses as an example. But basically, if you run the numbers, generally, if you look at homes passed or housing units and units, they're very, very similar numbers. So we now move to our third approach here. And again, this is a toolkit that focuses on roads and road segments. So this looks very similar to what we've seen previously. We have units, and then we also have our area shown and bounded. In this case, the buildable areas are shown in olive, and in this case, they're being filtered not by location density, but actually by a different metric, by the number of units or sort of premises passed per mile. So this is something that is exceptionally important and relevant to anyone doing a fiber build, okay? And in this particular view, we had it set at 20 units per mile, which is fairly inclusive. So what we're doing with this slide is we've turned off the existing coverage, and we've actually increased the threshold to 30 units per mile. So if you were paying $60,000 per mile for to deploy fiber, let's say, and it could be a mixture of aerial and underground. So and it of course is driven by availability of your crew and just a whole bunch of other parameters. But if that were the case, then in this case you're going to see less than $2,000 per home passed in these olive areas. So this lets you do a very quick translation in your head. And this is the same view now, except that it's showing actually instead of units passed, it's showing units per square mile. So this is, or no, per mile. So this is an important differentiator. So now as we zoom in here, we'll kind of see that small build area in greater detail. And you can also see that we've turned on a layer of roads. Okay, so this is very important. It was already included in the calculations, but now it's being visualized. So let's do this. We're going to select this area. So we're going to select it, and then we're going to export it as both a data set and a shape file. We're then going to use that selection to select the underlying roads, and you'll now see that they're all highlighted in yellow, which means they've been selected. And we're going to export that, and we'll save that as a file of line segments with a bunch of other KPIs associated. And then we're going to turn on some addresses. Now, the tool will probably not ship with an address database, but there are tons of publicly available address data sets that are available. And generally, counties have commissioned projects to figure out their own address space, and So this is not hard to come by. These are very, very large data sets. So if you packaged it up for the entire country, it's going to take a lot of size. So again, here we select the addresses for that area and export them. And just to show you, a little bit of what the underlying data looks like. In this case, the county has done a great job of building their data set. You can see that the pin drops are landing on top of the structure, not just at the centroid of the plot area. So that's great. And this means that your fiber design team will be able to accurately estimate drop lengths, based on this data. So basically what we have is several things. We've got a build area, with a bunch of KPIs. We've got road segments, we've got locations. This is all geospatial data, plus it can be viewed as a spreadsheet data too. So what's interesting here is you can take a very small area like we've done, or a large area, which could be a county or a state or something larger. You can hand that to a fiber design team, and as they start doing a detailed design, you've basically got all the metrics that you need to build the business case. And if there are areas that you thought were going to be profitable and actually are not, by having all of this analytics up front, you preempt what would otherwise be a circular process where you identify a build area, you have your design team work on it, you find that the metrics are not good, and you throw it away. So it short circuits that process and makes everything much more efficient. So that's an example of sort of the design process. And then I'm going to go through a few other topics, and then we're getting closer to the end here. So something that has caught just about everyone's attention is the BEAD program. So it stands obviously for Broadband Equity, Access, Deployment, and Deployment Program. When the government gives out $42 billion and change, it tends to get people's attention. So I'm just going to run through a few definitional things and then talk about what's included in the tool, which should be very helpful here. So first of all, under BEAD, as you start reading the BEAD NOFO, or the Notice of Funding Opportunity, you'll see that it talks about 4 quote unquote reliable technologies. There are a bunch of other technologies, but from a BEAD perspective, there are only 4 that matter. Everyone has, there's been a lot of attention on the FCC's National Broadband Map. There's also what is called the Broadband Funding Map. And this is also came out much more recently, but also has exceptionally valuable information. And it is both a map and a set of data sets. And basically what it does is it identifies all the unserved and unserved locations as sort of one data set, and then also has a filter where it filters it by for those areas that have already received funding. So and it's actually very useful that the FCC is doing it, because it's a hard project to get it right, and so they're sort of doing some of this filtering and calculation for us. Basically, BEAD excludes areas that are subject to an enforceable commitment to provide qualifying broadband. And here is a map that visualizes nine of the programs. And so these are all available from the agencies that run the programs, but also from the FCC. And according to the GAO, there are over 100 federal programs in 15 agencies that fund broadband. So it's hard to overstate the complexity of this task. And so it's kind of an ongoing endeavor. So at this point, I want to just talk a little bit about another concept called projects. And this is something that the BEAD NOFO talks about. And it gets to the heart of what is eligible or not eligible for BEAD funding. So basically, the NOFO distinguishes a project, which could be a single location, or it could be thousands of locations. And projects can be subdivided into an unserved service project, or an underserved service project. And an unserved basically means that at least 80% of the locations must be unserved. And then an underserved means that 80% must be either unserved or underserved. And so basically there comes out, what this creates is what we call sort of compliance math that needs to be done. And this is something that you can't really do in your head, or at least I haven't met anyone. So, but here's, for instance, here's a map of unserved, potential unserved, project areas. And this is being visualized at a hexagon level. And each of these hexagons, that's color-coded, sort of a mustard color, 80% of the locations are unserved. And we've done sort of a calculation in the background to establish that. And similarly with underserved, you can visualize it and it looks similar, but it's a broader area. Where it gets interesting is when you drill down in, and you can see the exact areas. You can also see, like this is an unserved, looking at unserved areas, you can see the percentage of locations that are unserved versus those that are not. And you can also see, for instance, here, if it's just above 80%, it turns mustard color. Here at 75, it doesn't. So, so you can go in and create very customized areas, but many providers in thinking about BEAD will try to say, let me just grab some areas that already qualify. And basically the National Hex Toolkit, which we'll talk about in a moment, and the Fiber Strategy Toolkit both have layers where you can click a button and turn this on. Very, very powerful. The other thing that's important is the NOFO talks about high cost in two very different contexts. When the NOFO was first issued, there's a paragraph that talks about high cost areas. And the last sentence says the NTIA will release further information regarding the identification of high cost areas for purposes of BEAD funding at a later date. Well, that later date has arrived. And so we'll show you some slides about that. Separately, there's a concept of a high cost threshold. And this is a number, not an area, but it's a number that can be established by each state. And so we'll talk about that in a moment as well. So high cost areas, they're significant for a couple of reasons. One is under BEAD, the minimum 25% match can be waived for construction that's occurring in a high cost area. So that's very consequential. The other thing is the mechanism of the federal government for funding low-cost households, the Affordable Connectivity Program. The monthly amount associated with that increases from $30 to $75, subject to certain conditions. And that's also very consequential, because if you're in a remote area, usually it's expensive to build a network. And even though we like to have wonderfully low pricing everywhere, it's often, broadband pricing is often fairly high in remote areas. And so that's a very nice change. And there are press releases here from the FCC and the NTIA drilling into that. And then separately, with the high cost threshold, which again is decided by state, it means above that dollar threshold under BEAD, they're not required to build fiber, but they could consider other technologies. And generally fiber is is immensely robust and is future-proof and is therefore highly desirable. But above a certain dollar threshold, it may become overly expensive. And so that's something for states to figure out. So where are high cost areas? So the FCC recently, or the NTIA recently released this. So this is the lower 48 states. And actually Alaska is interesting because a large portion of the state is designated a high cost area. And so here's another example. We talked about project areas. If they end up landing in a high cost area, then of course there's special treatment, because then you could get 100% funding without any kind of match. And so here you can also see that in most of the unserved areas, within these boundaries, almost 100% of the locations are unserved. There are a few areas like down here that aren't. There are a few areas that are up here that aren't. And because these tools are very flexible and they show layers of technology, we can actually investigate, not that we need to, we can investigate why that is. And so here you've got some DSL that gets it at least above 25.3. Here you've got a fiber build, but it doesn't cover all the locations. So this gives you some insight as to what's happening. Okay, and then with the extremely high cost threshold, there's a consulting firm, Cartesian, that did a very nice white paper and did a webinar a couple weeks ago and addressed this question. And they kind of put this together in conjunction with the Fiber Broadband Association. And so what's interesting here, there's a lot of material to read. There are also some preliminary estimates per state in terms of where this threshold should be. And there's also a spreadsheet model that lets you investigate and customize on your own. And again, this is something that's relevant to state broadband offices. And just to give you a sense of what does this look like, we've built into our tools sort of pre-release versions, just some algorithms that attempt to visualize it. So if you were to have a very tight filter, and this is probably in the $50,000 per location threshold, this is what it would look like. It would look like a scatter of lots of very distinct dots that would not be in urban areas. And if you had a more generous algorithm, maybe at a $5,000 level, it would look something like this. So every state needs to make a decision, and ultimately that dollar figure will indicate which areas are either above or below the threshold. But this gives you a little bit of perspective on that. So finally, let's see, and we're getting towards the end here. Just what are the things that we should think about conceptually in planning? So an investor looks at density, at competition or the lack of competition, and then also affordability, which could be either high income or low income, with appropriate subsidies. They also care about existing deployments, what technologies are there and so forth. And if they're involved in BEAD, then they need to know a bunch of metrics there. Governments, both federal and state, will look at incentivizing the private sector. States are required to come up with, make a decision about the high cost threshold, and they'll want to have some sort of robust plan. So the question is, where is the state of tool development to support each of these decisions? And I would argue that it's largely mission accomplished. Okay, now many investors and service providers will say, gee, I don't understand this. And that's definitely the case. And a lot of states are working through these issues. So there's a lot of thinking and analysis and decision-making to be done. But actually the tools, I would argue, exist for, to do all of this or most of this. And we can, talk about that in the Q&A, but there's a lot that is already packaged up in terms of tools. There's some other things that are a little bit more complex that are largely fall in the hands of states, as things to be done. A state is basically sketching out where they, an infrastructure deployment, which would be similar to building roads or sewage systems or anything else. And many have been very diligent in identifying unmet needs and identifying soft goals like, digital equity plans, and putting in place an array of programs to support those objectives. What hasn't happened, at least, from what I can see to date, is just high resolution maps of where they would like to build, and that would be a very valuable thing, which locations to deploy or what technologies to deploy. And this is really a product of deciding on their high cost threshold and then looking at the implications. And then more generally running the numbers and seeing how all of this relates to their budgets. And if you want to think in terms of a flow chart, a provider, someone who's a for-profit, ISP or investor, will generally just look for attractive, profitable areas to build, period. And so there's a set of analysis that they'll do there. And then, they can, if those look good, they can capitalize it and build it, and there are no other boxes to check. If they decide they're going to pursue BEAD, eligible areas, or pursue other funding programs like Capital Projects Fund, then there's a second set of activities. They need to do the analyses, and then they will oftentimes engage a grant writer or use funding-oriented websites or other things to sort of figure out, BEAD, and then they'll apply for BEAD funding, and they might or might not win the award. But those are some common thought processes from an investor perspective. At a state level, a couple of different approaches that a state can take, and typically what we've seen is, states assume a degree of sophistication on the part of ISPs, and they'll come up with a variety of programs. They'll often provide shape files of state-specific data and either static maps or streaming maps, and then kind of put it out there and see how people respond. And in the best possible scenario, you've got a rush of people and it's very competitive and everyone wants to do it. Another approach that we're sort of encouraging people to think about is what we call kind of a data-driven approach. And this is where you articulate very specific geospatial goals. Maybe you say, this is what's uncovered that we would like to see covered, and perhaps in a prioritized list and relating that. And some of these areas, by the way, are things that don't need government funding. Like there are highly profitable areas that can be built but haven't been built yet. So this doesn't all mean government resources. And then we're also encouraging people to think about providing all of your stakeholders, including ISPs in particular, who'd want to participate, with a piece of software that shows all of the data in a geospatial visualized format. And we've actually built prototypes of this for states to look at and consider doing. And so, a thought for states is broadbandtoolkit.com has invested heavily in developing sophisticated planning tools, and the underlying data supports every state and basically every relevant territory. And what's interesting is once a state exists, once a tool exists, a lot of things become really easy. So things that would previously be labor intensive, you can just do. And so one of the dialogues we're hoping to have with states is just, what challenging problems are you trying to solve, and what keeps you from doing a detailed pro forma? And we're looking for one or two volunteer states to do some of these more complex exercises, just as an example, sort of demonstrating that they can be done and sort of how tools relate to that. So just, a couple quick footnotes. These are some of the tools that we have that are out there and commercially available. And then the Fiber Strategy Toolkit I've referred to. And then those of you who are Fiber Broadband Association members can, click on their website and get a discount on each of these tools. And you can also download for free what's called Fiber Finder, which is another tool. And also, as Drew mentioned, we had a great webinar about a week ago, and you have a bunch of other companies that are doing interesting and compelling work, each in slightly different areas. And I would encourage you to watch those, to watch that broadband breakfast session as well. And then if you have any questions, reach out to us. And with that, I will de-share the presentation and come back, and we'll start our Q&A session.
Yeah, lesson of Zoom. Learn to unmute. We have a number of questions here, and let me go ahead and tee these up. Some basic, some more advanced, and we'll just kind of tick through them. Randy, does your data set include the names of the broadband providers?
And the answer is, it depends upon the toolkit, but within the Fiber Strategy Toolkit, the answer is yes. And you can click on for fiber builds in particular, we show that. For the others, let's see, for instance, in the national hex, it does not. We actually have an earlier toolkit that had technology and competitive module, and that sort of does it at track level. But probably I would refer you to the fiber strategy toolkit for that level of detail, and that would really be related to the fiber layer.
Okay. Another question that's just come in is your data using CostQuest Fabric? If so, if a state agency would like to make this information publicly available or publicly viewable, would a separate CostQuest license need to be obtained? Do you have an answer for that one?
Yeah, so basically we are using the data source that we're using is all from public domain information. It's information that's been released by the FCC or others, so it's not under a CostQuest license. So we have, the tool. We have, tons of data that was, part of the FCC map, and so what our tool doesn't show. For instance, if you had CostQuest data, you would see the individual exact longitude, latitude of each location. So we don't have that. Now in our pre-engineering toolkit, we did show individual homes and businesses, and there we were using a public domain source. But you could conceptually, if you have the appropriate license from CostQuest, you could conceptually link the pieces. Okay, and that's probably a broader question of licensing and so forth. But so anyway, we try to provide as much as we possibly can from starting with public sources. And you can generate maps, and a state could use this, and we'd love to just have a dialogue with you on just the layers in which it could be used, because there are a lot of applications.
We have another question about can your data be integrated into an enterprise GIS platform such as Esri, Mapbox, Leaflet, etc.?
And basically all of the data is they're in industry standard file formats, so they're shape formats or other industry standards, and we sort of license it for a team of individual users, and then of course people can generate content and use it in Zooms and put it in printed materials and so forth. And then if you'd like to integrate it into an enterprise platform, we would probably have a discussion of just what's the scope of usage and so forth. And so conceptually, yes, although the license is really for a team of individual users.
All right. Another question is, how often will this data be updated to show additional project areas that have not yet been made available to the public?
So basically, a lot of people sell software as a service or subscriptions. We don't. We sort of sell a tool as you click it once and you buy it, and we do update it. You'll get automatic free updates for content, and basically with each data layer, we just sort of make a decision on how frequently to update it, based on how many moving parts there are and how critical it is. So for instance, when obviously at 6-month intervals, when the FCC does a big major release, we had a bunch of tools, and in the latest release in May and June, all of that stuff got updated, because those are extremely important. And but so that's something that we decide on a layer by layer basis.
Okay, here's a question. Though it's useful to see the data aggregated by hex, these boundaries, are somewhat artificial. Oftentimes, the funding and construction of projects has to abide by various political boundaries, counties, municipalities, congressional districts, etc. How easy is it to translate the hex-bound broadband serviceable locations to other units of aggregation?
So I would say two things. One is, depending upon the tool, we have some tools that actually do things at a block level, and so that and if that's something that you need, we can also do variations that do that. Basically the information that's available to the public, doesn't resolve below the block or the hexagon unless you have a CostQuest license, and so that gets into a whole nother domain. And so right now, we sort of cut off the boundary there. Although, frankly, it's you can figure out a lot. And like built into the tools, we have your municipal boundaries, we have community anchor institutions, we've got PSAP 911 boundaries, we've got radio license areas for people who are wireless. So we've got tons of other boundaries, and you can definitely aggregate these boundaries, in the context of other larger political boundaries, and that's very easy to do with the tool. And again, a level 8 hex is about 0.8 square kilometers, so it's pretty small.
Okay. We have a question about, will this tool be available to overlay filter by funding project and by awardee?
Yes, if you have that information. So the tool is actually extensible. So if you have your own, build area, you can add that as a layer. If you have, if you have other data sets that are relevant to your decision making, you can add those as layers as well. So that's actually very easy to do. So we understand that people who are in the real world have lots of data sets, and they want the data sets to talk to one another. So that's so we've enabled that.
We have another question. This one's from Leighton Olson. There was a good article about a Virginia Tech map challenge in which 80,000 of 180,000 were accepted, yielding a good amount of additional funding. Are there state-by-state examples or other summaries showing unserved, underserved, served, challenges accepted, dollar differences? Any reaction to that, Randy?
So in fact, part of what the National HEX Toolkit does is it includes basically all of the challenges that were received and accepted by the FCC and kind of released to the public in, I want to say, January or February of this year. I think probably February, that were missing location challenges. So it shows that, and those were also then rolled into the Fabric version 2, which is the basis of each of the main tools right now. And then also you can click on a layer that shows that basically shows your eligible project area. So this is driven from a lot of the data in the FCC funding site, plus other calculations. You still need to do some compliance calculations, and this should give you a very, very good picture. What it doesn't do is decisions that are being made day by day at a state level. That's just too granular, and there are too many. I mean, as that flows back to the FCC, then we'll be doing refreshes. But there's some sort of latency in particularly with state level programs. And what's interesting too is the FCC works really hard to disclose a systematic set of data, and it's out there, but it's really hard to do, and a lot of states. It's a challenging process. And so there are a lot of states who say run challenge processes. They may have thousands of challenges, but they haven't gotten around to processing them yet. And so there's a certain messiness that, unless you're just focused solely on that tool, on that state and intimately involved in the processes, that's hard to address sort of real time.
All right.
And let's see. I know in terms. Oh yeah.
We're close to the hour. We're a little past the hour, but let's just keep going with these two questions, and then we'll see whether there's additional interest in staying on. Randy's agreed to be available for a little bit longer if you want to continue the dialogue. But let's just finish these two questions that we've got so far. Leighton Olson also asks, how many state university broadband labs and state broadband offices have this level of mapping tools? Do you have any insight into that question, Randy?
That's a really good question. I guess my impression is that there are a lot of people who are, GIS experts and gurus who build tools for a specific purpose. We're not aware. We're aware of some cloud-based platforms, but we're not aware of a lot of sort of shrink wrap software programs similar to ours that attempt to aggregate everything. That's really what we're trying to do. And so there is a lot of really good stuff that's happened at a university level. So for instance, well, we wrote a white paper, which we called State of the States, and we looked at North Carolina and Georgia. And what's interesting is in that case, they were state broadband offices that were leveraging, wonderful expertise at local universities. And at the universities, you had people doing great stuff. And that was actually described in the white paper. And there was also a Fiber for Breakfast webinar where we all collectively presented it. So I would encourage you to go to broadbandtoolkit.com and then look at perspectives, which is the white paper, and read about that. And also on the question on just data sources, if you go to the product page for each of these toolkits, you'll see a document called Introduction, and it will then describe a lot of the data sources. And like with the National HEX, it's about a 40-page document. So, it goes into a lot of detail and describes use cases, and so it's comprehensive. And then if you have questions, reach out, and my contact information was the last slide. And so, would love to have a dialogue with either with people of any kind of organization who have an interest in this space.
Well, here's one last question that we have. It's, can you list all the data sources that is feeding into your system or product?
And the answer is yes, and I would refer you to the introductory pieces with each toolkit. Like go to the National HEX and read the introduction, and it describes those. And then for the fiber strategy, same thing. It'll give you some of the background there. And the answer is a little bit vague because it varies by toolkit. We've got a whole bunch of different toolkits that do different things, and obviously have different data sets.
Well, this has been wonderful. Thank you, Randy, for spending the time to walk through the tools available on broadbandtoolkit.com. We've come to the end of our time, and I think we've answered all the questions that have been posed in the Q&A. In addition to thanking our presenter and guest, I want to remind you that Broadband Breakfast Live Online happens every Wednesday at 12 noon. We have a really special edition tomorrow when we're talking with the CEO of Gigapower and the president of AT&T. And Gigapower is, of course, the joint venture AT&T is doing with BlackRock, the private equity firm. And we also have Roger Entner of Recon Analysis. So you won't want to miss that. You have to use a special URL. It's all available on broadbandbreakfast.com to sign up. But then next Wednesday, we'll be back at the regular URL that you've been using. And want to remind you that 9 days from today, we have our BEAD Implementation Summit in Washington, D.C. at Clydes of Gallery Place. You do have to register to attend. We hope to see many of you there. There will also be a webcast, $35 to attend the webcast. Please go ahead and find the sign up on broadbandbreakfast.com. On behalf of our guest, Randy Lenning, so good to have you and to be able to go in a more comprehensive fashion through the features and functions of broadbandtoolkit.com. Until next time, we'll see you all later. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.